You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Okay, so here's what happened. We went out to the Devil's Den to record this Ask a Guide, and welcome, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, to Addressing Gettysburg's Ask a Guide. We went out to the Devil's Den to record this Ask a Guide and set up. And by the way, the weather report, the reason we chose the day to do it, the reason we chose today was because the weather forecast said it was going to be the only partly sunny day all week. The weather here has been terrible, ladies and gentlemen. I have a friend out in Minnesota. She's saying, "Oh, it's like 73 degrees today, and it's just so wonderful. You know, great, good for you." Out here, it's cold, it's gray, it's terrible. Anyway, we set up, we get up there, we're warming up, and we're wrapped in blankets, we've got jackets on, and it's cold, it's windy. And we start the show, we get all the way to the last question, and then Tim Smith is talking. I don't hear him talking anymore in my headphones. I go, "Wait a second, Tim, what happened? I don't hear you." And then I don't hear myself, and then I realize the battery had died. The battery had died, ladies and gentlemen. And so I'm like, we don't have another set of batteries. This is stupid. I should have thought of another set of batteries. The cold apparently just cuts the battery life down really hard. So I turn it back on. I'm able to get a couple of minutes out of it. And then guess what? You guessed it, dies again. So then I say, okay, that's it. I tried to get it going again and it wouldn't start. So we couldn't get it going. So anyway, last question gets cut off. That's what you're going to hear in this episode of Addressing Gettysburg's Ask a Gettysburg Guide. And I hope you enjoy it anyway. And don't forget, keep those questions coming in. If they have nothing to do with the location that we're going to be at for the next one, which we don't know what that is yet, but if they have not, just send your question and it doesn't matter. Matt@addressinggettysburg.com. Also, if you want to take a tour with any of the guides that you hear on Addressing Gettysburg, Matt@addressinggettysburg.com. Okay, enjoy.
What is this called?
Ask a Guy?
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Addressing Gettysburg on this Ask a Gettysburg Guide number 14, I believe. Is that right, Eric? 14. Sitting here with me. We're at the 99th Pennsylvania on top of Devil's Den, by the way. With me is Bob Steenstra. Hello, Bob.
Hello, Matt. Hello, everybody.
How are you doing during this COVID crisis?
I'm not suffering. Some people in the country are.
Mm-hmm. Are you bored?
No.
Or you're keeping yourself busy?
I'm keeping myself busy. I'm doing a little writing. So
now you're retired, though.
I am a retired school teacher.
Right.
Living off the public dole. I made all those millions of dollars being a school teacher. We were talking earlier about making lots of money educating people.
Sure.
Well, school teachers don't and guides don't.
I know. Well, I remember last summer when we went out on your yacht. And we had a great time.
So you call a little 16-foot boat a yacht? Huh?
Well, considering I have just a little toy boat that I play with in the bathtub, yes, that is a yacht.
All right,
no, okay, so you're doing good, but you're retired, so it's basically nothing's really changed for you.
Well, except that this is the great time of year to be here on this battlefield, sharing stories that happened here with people who want to hear them. I think I can speak for Tim too. We really miss this.
Yeah.
I mean, financially, it's an important time for us.
It is hurting the guides.
Right.
A lot.
Financially, it hurts guides.
It's hurting a lot of people, and woe be it to anybody if we find out that this was all for naught. Oh, Bob, right?
Yeah, it's okay.
I mean, Bob's going to get that rebel flag, and he's going to jump up on the... No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So, also with us today, I mean, we're doing Devil's Den, ladies and gentlemen, so who else would we have but the great Timothy Smith? Hello, Tim. How are you?
Hello.
Tim, you have a book about the Devil's Den, and I'm looking at it here. I don't have my glasses, so it says Devil's Den, and then what is the subtitle there? A History and Guide?
Yep, A History and Guide. It came out in 1997, so it's been out for 23 years.
And that's available on addressinggettysburg.com/books. You can go and get that there, get your copy. And we have a lot of good questions today. Eric is also with us. Eric, the producer. Hello, Eric.
Hello.
Okay. We have a lot of very good questions today. People more than normal, so we're going to try to get through this as fast as we can. I think this is going to be a 4-hour show, though. All right, let's start here with Brian Derenick, and he makes his debut. He emailed me, and he has these few questions. 1, can you talk to how the wounding of General Hood early in the action impacted the execution of the Confederate attack on Devil's Den, specifically the split of Robertson's brigade with the 3rd Arkansas and 1st Texas moving to the left and the 4th and 5th Texas following Law's brigade to the right? And the second question is, can you provide any details as to how the burials of Confederate and Union dead were handled after the battle in such difficult terrain? Were bodies ever reinterred as from the other parts of the battlefield? So let's start with number 1, Hood's wounding.
Well, that's interesting. And I was looking through the questions that you sent me ahead of time, some of the questions, and I was impressed by the questions, and they were very, very good questions, I thought, and insightful questions. And of course, one of the more insightful questions about Devil's Den is what would have happened if General Hood had not been wounded at the outset of the attack. And basically, on July 2nd, when General James Longstreet launches his massive assault against the Union left flank, General Hood's division is leading the assault. And probably just as they march off the ridge, maybe, like a minute into the assault, as they're descending out of the wood line in the distance on Seminary Ridge or Warfield Ridge towards Devil's Den, a fragment, an artillery shell fragment, lodges into his arm, and Hood is out of the action. So almost before it begins, Hood is wounded. Now, this is an issue because General John Bell Hood is probably the best division commander in the Confederate Army. He is a really good division commander. Of course, as we know, later in the war, he's not much of an army commander.
Right.
But he is a good division commander, and he commands 4 brigades of about 1,500 men each. And he's in control of the movements of those 4 brigades. But the question actually gets to a different point, and that's that when John Bell Hood arrives in position on to launch the attack on July 2nd, he doesn't really approve of the attack. And, the attack is not going to go off as General Longstreet had wanted it to, or Robert E. Lee wanted it to anyway, because, of course, General Daniel Edgar Sickles has moved forward and is occupying a position from the Peach Orchard along the Emmitsburg Road and then bent back towards this massive rocks that we're sitting on Devil's Den. When Sickles moved forward, it really threw a wrench into Lee's ultimate plan on July 2nd, which was to bring McLaws' division out from Seminary Ridge, put them perpendicular to the Emmitsburg Road, and they were to launch an assault up the Emmitsburg Road towards, Cemetery Ridge. But when they got out there along Seminary Ridge, General Sickles was occupying the Peach Orchard, so there was no way for them to take a position in the Peach Orchard perpendicular to the Emmitsburg Road. So they sort of just went parallel to the Peach Orchard, and then they brought up Hood's division and threw them on the end of the line, and then Hood would launch the attack against Sickles' position here along the area of Devil's Den. But that wasn't the plan initially. And when Hood got in a position, Hood immediately did not like the plan. Hood preferred an idea where they swing their troops around Big Round Top and maybe hit the Union line from the flank or the rear. But time had passed. It was already getting close to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. General Longstreet just wanted the attack to go on as planned, or as they arrived and launched the attack. Hood sort of argued a little bit with Longstreet. Here's one of the points about this is that we don't have many sources to go by when we discuss this. It's not like we're delving into dozens of sources. We have like 2 or 3 sources of this event. But we have John Bell Hood wrote an autobiography after the Civil War. We have a couple reminiscence from men in the 1st Texas. We have, of course, Longstreet's autobiography, and we have a Battles and Leaders of the Civil War reminiscence written by Evander Law. So when we put these things together, it appears if Hood argues with Longstreet, sometimes it's called the protest, and then Hood goes back to line, but it appears if Hood is going to do something different anyway. And so Hood, when the assault occurs, part of Law's brigade heads towards the backside of Big Round Top, and part of it heads towards Devil's Den and Little Round Top, creating a gap, which ultimately will be, I should say, ultimately, these units are going to become intermingled because of all the confusion in the attack. And
right, that wasn't by design.
It wasn't by design, but Hood may be sending part of Law's brigade towards the backside of Big Round Top by design. Oh. But he's wounded, and we'll really never know. And the other thing that occurs is, I know this is very complicated. I think the thing that people should remember about it is there's a massive amount of confusion that occurs. And because Hood is busy arguing with Longstreet, and the regimental commanders of the different units don't quite realize that the plan has changed from the original plan. And at the very first thing that happens when they advance is the 1st Texas and the 3rd Arkansas swing around, and it appears as if they have not been told that the plan has changed at all. And they start marching up the Emmitsburg Road as the original plan had called for before they were in position. Now, how they know that they're supposed to attack up the Emmitsburg Road and how they don't know that the plan has changed, we don't have any evidence of that. But at the very initiation of the assault, the 1st Texas and 3rd Arkansas appeared to be moving northward up along the Emmitsburg Road towards the Peach Orchard, and in the other part of the Texas Brigade, the 4th and 5th Texas, are heading straight across the field towards Little Round Top, and they are sort of connecting to Law's brigade that seems to be moving towards the backside of Big Round Top, and there's a big gap that's created, and ultimately Alabama units from the end of the line are going to have to shift it into that gap. And here's the point of the question that the person's asking is, Hood is wounded at this moment with all this confusion going on. And if Hood had not been wounded, he would have known what it was that he was trying to achieve. At the very least, Hood would have, if he didn't intend on the 1st Texas and 3rd Arkansas moving in that direction up the Emmitsburg Road, he would have corrected immediately. But Hood is wounded, and a massive amount of chaos occurs because of his wounding. Some people have gone so far as to say that this is one of the critical moments in the battle, Hood's wounding on July 2nd. And because Hood is wounded, Evander Law will be pulled off of his brigade and will be sent to division command. And there's really no evidence that Evander Law executes an order prior or until the battle is over. So no one is an overall command of the division. And meanwhile, Jerome Robertson, his brigade ends up partly attacking Devil's Den, partly attacking Little Round Top. It doesn't seem like he exercises control at it either. So no one's commanding Law's brigade, no one's commanding Robertson's brigade, and no one's commanding the division. And of course, fortunately for the Southerners, they have Henry Lewis Benning, who will actually, when he gets to Devil's Den, sort of pull all these units together. But the cohesion of the Southern assault on July 2nd on the southern end of the battlefield is destroyed by Hood's wounding.
As is his arm.
Yeah, and Hood, they won't amputate his arm, but his arm will sort of dangle by his side for the rest of his life.
Okay. And then how about the part about the burials of the Confederates?
I think that's pretty easy. I think the ultimate answer to that question is that There's lots of rocks. You can just look at the ground, and it doesn't matter where you go around here. You're not going to be able to bury bodies very effectively. So in the end, the bodies are not buried very deep. And of course, what happens is the bodies, it'll rain and the bodies will wash up. And Devil's Den is going to be a place where, for months and years after the battle, people visit it, and there's account after account of bodies eroding out of the ground. And people can come here and see a horrible situation where not only did you have the eerie appearance of the rocks, but you have the bones on the ground and deteriorating out of the ground.
People could come here and see back then. You're not saying people can come here now and see that.
That's right. No bones now.
No bones now that we know of.
But for years after the battle, it was common to find bodies or bones at Devil's Den.
Well, here's one that we hear a lot. People hear a lot. Darth Etzcorn, he asks, how did the Devil's Den get its name?
Well, that's a very complicated thing too. When I wrote the book Devil's Den, or when Gary Edelman and I started to write the book Devil's Den in the 1990s, it was just going to be a pamphlet. And I was going to have a really minor chapter on the battle at Devil's Den, and mostly it was a walking tour at Devil's Den. But one of the things I wanted to handle was this question of how Devil's Den got its name and when it got its name. And still, to this day, I'm still not clear on exactly how this goes. But in a simple sense, in south central Pennsylvania, every place where there's large amounts of rocks has a name associated with the devil. I think the Pennsylvania German farmers believed that the devil placed rocks in their fields to mess with them. So, if there's a place where it's a lot of rocks, they name it after the devil. And we have down not too far in Maryland, the Devil's Backbone. We have the Devil's Race Course not far from here, the Devil's Pea Patch, and of course, at Gettysburg, we have a place called Devil's Den. Now, early on, when you read the accounts of the locals, it is clear that Devil's Den is not necessarily this place, but there's a few accounts that call Little Round Top Devil's Den. This area of the battlefield with these large massive diabase boulders is commonly referred to as the Devil's this or the Devil's that. Now, since our book came out, we have a whole chapter in the book about when it was called Devil's Den and who gave it the name Devil's Den. But since the book came out, there are several other pieces of information. Bill Stiple of New Jersey found a newspaper article, and he shared it with me, by a Confederate soldier of Anderson's brigade writing on July 11th. And he refers to a place by name called Devil's Den. But it's clear in his letter, he's referring to Little Round Top as Devil's Den. And he says, called by the locals Devil's Den. And there's also and I did not have this in the Devil's Den book at the time, there's a Frank Leslie's illustration of the rocks that we call Devil's Den, and it is labeled Devil's Den. So it is clear that some locals are telling people that this area down here on the southern end of the battlefield is called Devil's Den, whether they're referring to Devil's Den specifically or Little Round Top. And that name sort of it gets attached to it after the battle in some writings, and it's John Batchelder who really runs away with the name and starts calling it that and telling people that this should be referred to as Devil's Den. But it's not a term that's used by a large amount of townspeople because there are other names given to this area in early writings and
like
don't mention it. Sometimes you see like in a November 1864 photograph, it's called they call it the Signal Rocks.
Okay.
Sometimes they call it the Big Rocks. But the one thing I think is important about the name is that early on, people decide to start calling this Devil's Den, and by the end of the Civil War, it's most people are calling it Devil's Den. But we have no evidence predating the battle of a document that refers to it as Devil's Den.
So then the story that people used to tell their children not to go down here because a giant snake named the Devil lived
now,
here.
That story starts in 1875 when Emanuel Bushman writes an article to, he's a local townsperson, wrote an article to the Baltimore newspaper and told the story about the giant snake that lived down here, and he was named the Devil. And then, of course, Sally Myers, and I think it's 1913 actually, another local Gettysburg person said that, to Gettysburgers, that's always been known as the Devil's Den.
But we have no written evidence that it has before the battle.
That's right.
Okay.
So we have people after the battle saying it was called Devil's Den before the battle.
Right.
But we have no... I'd love a newspaper article.
Because we know that people after a major event will say anything to get part of the story, to be part of the story. They'll, so this person was quoted as saying it was always called that.
Perhaps some people did refer to this area as Devil's Den. But again, the evidence that I have for Devil's Den is like Little Round Top being called Devil's Den.
Okay.
So just again, an area of large rocks is known as the Devil.
And Little Round Top wasn't called Little Round Top before the battle,
no,
right?
Definitely not. And that's one of the reasons why we question Joshua Chamberlain's original official report, because the one that was published in the official reports, because he mentions Little Round Top by name at a time when it was not being referred to as Little Round Top. You see this whole area being called the Round Tops.
Yeah.
And it's clear that Big Round Top is called Round Top, but it doesn't seem until a little later that there's a differentiation between Little Round Top and Big Round Top. It seems to be all one mass. And sometimes early on you see it referred to as Granite Spur of Round Top, or the Granite Hill, or again, Devil's Den.
Like Sugarloaf or something like that?
Yeah, there's different references to it in official reports, but there's only like two references I think there's three references in the official reports to the term Little Round Top. And again, the official reports are the printed version of the official reports in the 1880s, based on the original official reports written in the 1860s. So you have to actually go to the National Archives, pull the original official reports, and see if that terminology is used in them.
And have you?
Yes.
And
the Joshua Chamberlain reference is pretty. It doesn't appear to be an 1863 document. But then we also have one from Gibbs Battery, where they call it Little Round Top or Weeds Hill. Or maybe they say Weeds Hill, now called Little Round Top, something like that in it.
Because we died up there.
It seems like that one might be post-war. And then we also have a Vermont. I think there's one of the Vermont units mentions Little Round Top. But again, one of our problems is the official reports is printed in the 1880s dealing with documents that are presented as original official reports, and everyone is trying to doctor or change their words 20 years later. And the War Department is trying to be cautious about this and not introduce anything into the official reports. It's not a document that was written at the time. But then you got that whole historicist controversy, where Sickles is trying to get things put into the official record that, later, that aren't really part of the official record. So it's fascinating. I did pull James Smith's original official report, and he does refer to this as the Devil's Cave, the battery commander here.
Right. All right. Gettysburger RN says, I've heard it mentioned that Smith's battery, speaking of Smith, was not really deployed where the monument is placed. So where was it really deployed, and where would their limber chests have been positioned?
Well, I guess it's a two-part question. The one is, we know that Smith's Battery is not placed. I'm looking at Smith's Battery, where the monument is today, because in New York at Gettysburg, I believe it was, or maybe it's in the Regimental History of the 4th New York Independent Battery by James Smith. He mentioned there was a conversation specifically mentioned between him and Henry Hunt during the dedication ceremony of the monument, and both Smith and Hunt say the monument's placed in the wrong position, that they were not there. Now, so for years, people knew that there was discussion that Smith's Battery was not in the right place. But from that, people then suggested that Smith's Battery is actually down on the plateau in front of the triangular-shaped field, and that was the true position of Smith's Battery. That was actually the position given to Smith's Battery by Kathy George in an article she wrote on Devil's Den in 1984, I believe, and then that article's reprinted in Gettysburg Magazine, issue number 1. And so a lot of people thought that that's where Smith's Battery was based on that research.
You mean right here off the road, not down the slope, right?
If you look at Sickles Avenue, down the hill from the 99th Pennsylvania Monument, where we are positioned right now, there's a plateau just on the other side of the road. We could say it's the west side of Sickles Avenue.
Yeah.
And Kathy George had earmarked that as the position of the battery.
Okay.
And when we started researching our book, Devil's Den, A History and Guide, Gary, I told Gary that, I'd read a lot about it, and that's where the battery's positioned. And I based that on Kathy George's article. But then we started examining all the accounts that she used for the basis of that identification and all the accounts that we'd come up with that she was unaware of. And we quickly realized that the evidence suggests that Smith's Battery is actually on top of the hill here, just to the north in the 99th Pennsylvania Monument. And the guns were actually on top of this rise of ground and not down on that plateau. And, in the bigger scheme of things, we're only talking about a difference of about 70 yards, maybe. It's not that far. But clearly, the bulk of the evidence has the guns on top of the hill. And there's all kinds of things. Gary was really into this, Gary Edelman. He wrote an appendix in our Devil's Den book about where were Smith's guns. And he went on to write a Gettysburg Magazine article about where was the location of Smith's guns. And if you read that, you can clearly see the guns are on top of the hill. I mean, not to mention the least of which, there's the 99th Pennsylvania states that their monument is placed where one of Smith's guns was near where the location of one of Smith's guns that was overrun by the Confederate Army. And at one point, one of their flags is leaning against the side of one of his guns, and they say it's near the monument. So there's all kinds of stuff. The other thing is interesting is there's not enough room. This is the second part of his question on the Hawks Ridge itself, so they have to place the limber chests and the caissons at the base of the hill on the east side of the Hawks Ridge in the Valley of Death. And there's actually a flank marker down there in the Valley of Death that marks near the spot where Smith's limber chests and caissons were located. And I got to tell you, Bob, I don't know if you've ever had people that want to see where this marker is, but this is, even for me who knows where the marker is, it's very difficult in the summer to actually take somebody and find that flank marker down in the valley.
And it's a flank marker of Smith's.
Yeah, it's a flank marker, but really the flank marker is being used not to mark the flank of their battery, but to mark the location of where the limber chests and the caissons were located at the bottom of the hill. And it's on the west side of Crawford, the modern Crawford Avenue, in a really swampy area. Do you ever take people out there, Bob?
I have not, no. Tim, I think we need to point out that a typical typical battery is 6 guns, which Smith's was, but only 4 of them were up here on the hill or Hawks Ridge, as you're talking about. Could you just talk about where were the other 2? The Park Service has them marked, but is that accurate? Smith has 6 guns, and according to Smith's account, from Smith we have an official report. We have the information in New York at Gettysburg pertaining to dedication of the monument. And then we also have a book written by Captain James Smith about his actions here. I should mention that several times I've met the great-grandson of Captain Smith. He's elderly. I'd imagine he's still around. When I met him, he was very elderly, but I believe he's still around. Ironically, Smith is born in Canada, but his great-grandson, his father was an archaeologist with the team of archaeologists that excavated Jamestown in the 1930s. And he grew up on Jamestown Island, and he's actually written a book about Jamestown. But he's been here several times, and he's got information from his
great-grandfather, and there's a photograph in our book that actually comes from him. The photograph isn't in very good shape, but it's Captain Smith during the war. And Smith's rear section was actually, he didn't have enough room, he said, on the top of the Houck's Ridge between where the ridge drops off and where the wooded area of Rose Woods existed. So he had to put two of the guns in the rear. And and I'm not an authority on artillery by any means, but I think generally speaking, there's 16 feet between each gun. Is that correct, Bob? Do you remember?
Yeah, I believe so. 16, 14 maybe.
So from here you can look across and see to the woods that there's not enough room for the 6 guns. So they put 4 guns on top of the crest to keep them 16 feet apart, and then 2 of the guns, a section, was sent down into the Valley of Death behind us, and that's where the rear section is, and the rear section is marked by a 2 guns. And in our book we discuss whether that marker placed by the War Department in the 2 guns is actually the spot where Smith's 2 rear guns were, or if they were a little bit closer and a little bit back near maybe with he says they're on a little hillock to the rear and in the valley. And those 2 guns will actually perform valuable service as the Southern Army is sweeping up the Valley of Death and across the area of Plum Run, and they end up firing across the slopes of Little Round Top at the Alabama and Texas troops.
Were they placed there just as a reserve, or were they placed there to cover the flank?
I think they were there to guard the flank of Sickles' Third Corps.
So for the listeners, where most people park when they come to Devil's Den, that's the area that that left section was able to cover
fire on
and provide valuable service, as you said.
And they performed valuable service prior to the 6th New Jersey and the 40th New York arriving as reinforcements in the Valley of Death.
Okay.
Tim, when Smith's battery is, let me go back to an earlier question, if that's okay.
Sure, Bob.
The one about John Bell Hood. I believe, although I can't give all the evidence for it, but given this battery or Winslow's battery, it seems more logical to me that the fire came from here that hit Hood.
Well, you might know that I think it was about 2000, the park put up a wayside exhibit, 2 wayside exhibits down here along Sickles Avenue at Devil's Den, not far from where we're sitting. And one of them talks about the 124th New York, and the other one talks about Smith's Battery. And they say on the wayside exhibit that John Bell Hood was wounded by shrapnel from Smith's Battery. And I don't know. Here's the thing that I suggest, and I try not to be too sarcastic here. John Bell Hood could have been wounded by one of Smith's guns on the top of Houck's Ridge firing at him, or he could have been hit by one of the 30 artillery pieces along the Wheatfield Road that were firing directly into the flank of his division. So right. The fact is, we don't know if he's wounded from Smith's guns or Winslow's guns or one of the batteries at the Peach Orchard. I had always just, assumed he was wounded from one of the batteries firing from the Peach Orchard, and I guess that's where some of my sarcasm comes from. I don't know how we're supposed to differentiate how, Hood is wounded. But there's a lot of Union artillery that immediately opens fire against the Southern advance as they come off of Seminary Ridge on July 2nd. And there's a sweeping crossfire of artillery coming from the Peach Orchard. Maybe that's why the 2 regiments, the 1st Texas and the 3rd Arkansas, initially start up the Emmitsburg Road. And, I didn't answer this completely when we were talking about that, but the 1st Texas and 3rd Arkansas move up the Emmitsburg Road, and then at some point, somebody says, hey, you're going in the wrong direction. Whether that's a staff officer from Hood or they realize it on their own, and they break off the northern movement, and then they turn, and then they head directly towards Devil's Den. So it would be the 1st Texas and the 3rd Arkansas that were involved in the initial assault on Devil's Den.
Okay.
And Tim, of the 6 guns that were in Smith's Battery, I believe 3 of them were actually captured, correct? You want to talk about why not the 4 that were up here?
So there were 4 guns up here initially when Hood advances. But when Hood's division, specifically the 1st Texas and 3rd Arkansas, reach the low ground at the base of Devil's Den or Houck's Ridge out here to the west of us, then the guns cannot be depressed enough to actually hit those soldiers. In the meantime, one of the 4 guns was actually disabled by counter artillery or counter battery fire, and they actually take one of Smith's guns off of the ridge, and that gun, along with the rear section, will be able to be pulled back. Smith actually, according to his book that he writes about it, believes he leaves the guns up here, takes the gunner's implements, and goes to the limbers in the rear section, believing that the Northern Army will, eventually subdue the Confederates attacking this area, and he'll be able to return to his guns at some point. But he's not able to return to the guns, and 3 of the guns end up being captured. But one of them is actually disabled, and they pull the gun off a little earlier in the fight. We're not exactly sure when. So 3 of the guns get away, 3 of the guns are captured. I should point out that during the entire Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederate Army captured 7 guns, I believe, from the Union Army, and 3 of them are right here.
You mean captured that they were able to retain?
Capture, retain,
and take out of here with them.
Away, right, and 3 of them are here.
Temporarily, they'll capture more.
Yeah. And I always like to bring up, how many guns did the Union Army capture of the Confederates during the battle?
None.
Now, we do know that there's a small cannon in the GAR building, and in the 1880s, they say it's made from the remnants of a Confederate gun that was left behind. So apparently, and the story is, one of these guns is taken back and is used by Henry's battalion, and they decide to leave behind a gun that they had that they didn't want anymore, and so they take these guns and leave one of theirs behind, and that gun ends up being used for a gun that is now in the GAR hall.
The one they left behind, was that a smoothbore then, and they got this nice Parrott to replace it? Is that how that worked?
Possibly. Believe me, I'm no authority on artillery. We probably have to ask when they are. There's a footnote in the Devil's Den book about the one at the GAR hall, but most likely.
One more thing, Matt, if you don't mind,
of course,
and if there's a question that I'm anticipating, then correct me. But could you, Tim, get us a little bit into the emotional state of James Smith as he's talking to the boys of the 124th, or just a little bit of what's going on with him during this incredible struggle here?
It's a good one. That's not in here, so good question.
Losing as an artillery commander, losing your guns is like the, worst thing that could happen. You don't want to lose your guns.
It's like you losing your ship if you're a Navy captain.
And there's some attached to this is some regret, and I think any of the commanders during the Civil War who's in charge of artillery, and the artillery is captured, you spend the rest of your life trying to justify how it was that you allowed your guns to be captured. You don't want to pull your guns away prematurely, but you don't want your guns to be captured. So there's this fine line that these artillerymen run. You don't want to spike a cannon, and then the enemy doesn't overrun your cannon, and then you can't fire your cannon because you've spiked it. And
spiking
so,
it means
spiking
driving
the
a
vent.
nail.
So, all the artillery commanders, I'd imagine each gun, somewhere, there is a bag, and in it is a nail, we call it a spike, and they spike the vent. And what you do is you run up and you drive this spike or nail into the vent hole, and then the gun can't be used. So if your battery is going to be overrun as you're dying, Matt, you would run up to the spike and you would spike the vent, and of course then you would die, then the enemy couldn't use your gun.
Right.
They would have to take the gun back behind the lines, and they'd have to get the spike out or drill the vent hole out to get the spike out, and then put something else, another insert in the vent hole.
And for everybody who's very new to all of this, the vent hole is the what part of the cannon?
It's in the breech of the cannon, and to fire the cannon, you drop a friction primer in the vent hole, and then when you pull the lanyard, there's a copper tube with a metal wire in it, and and then when you pull the friction primer out, when you pull the lanyard, it pulls the metal wire out of the copper tube with gunpowder in it, and it creates a spark that goes into the chamber, and that's how the powder bout explodes. It ejects the shell out.
Right.
So by putting a spike in the vent hole, the cannon cannot be fired again. Now, we have examples in the Civil War where someone fears their cannon's going to be overrun, so they spike the cannon, and then the Confederates or the Union don't overrun that position, and you look kind of silly because you can't fire your guns.
Right.
So what we've learned, I think, is that in the Civil War, they didn't like to spike their cannons, and they don't, they'd rather, ends up, they'd rather them be captured.
Right.
But Smith believes that when he leaves these guns, that the Union Army will recapture the guns. And they do temporarily. But, what happens is over the years, Smith begins to exaggerate the story of losing his guns. And by the time he writes his book, he, in his book, kind of maintains that the Union infantry fled the area and left him up here alone with his guns. Not that he fled when the Confederates got close, but all the infantry fled. And he said for 20 minutes, he and his gunners were alone on top of this ridge. And they kept firing, canister and case shot at the rebels and holding them at bay. And he has a dramatic quote in his book. I could look at the exact quote, but I'll paraphrase. He says, each of those 20 minutes contained 60 seconds. And in each of those seconds was a lifetime.
Oh, wow. A lot of lifetimes.
How about the quote, give him shot, the one that's down here on the old Wayside exhibit?
Yeah,
Is
in the old Wayside
exaggerated?
exhibit, they have a quote by him, and that's, again, from his book, but give him shot, give him hell, give him shell, hell, give him anything, something like that. I can't remember that one either.
I think that's how I recall it too. But is he also not pleading with the boys of the 124th
to come
New
back
York?
and to recapture the guns? But what he doesn't tell you, in point of fact, as soon as the Confederates get to the bottom of the hill, he doesn't wait for them to advance. He leaves. And the 124th New York then charged down the hill, and he goes to the rear section and spends the rest of the bout at the rear section, just hoping that at some point he's going to be able to return to the top of the hill and pull the three guns off, which he's never able to do. So I guess one of the things we could look at here is because of the placement of the guns and because the limber chests were at the bottom of the hill, he doesn't have the opportunity to bring the limber chests back up, hook up the guns, and get them out of here. And as a result, they're captured when Devil's Den's overrun.
Right, okay. All right, Tyler Fast History wants to know, what is the story of the Alfred Woad sketch that supposedly shows Ward's brigade fleeing from the Devil's Den?
I really like that he asked that. And I wonder, the person who asked this, I wonder if they're really curious about it, or they know that I am really curious about this. And so basically, there's this Alfred Woad sketch, and perhaps we could get the sketch and post it on your site at some point so that people could see it.
Sure.
But basically, it's a sketch that was used in Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, I believe. And it says Devil's Den, and it shows the Union Army retreating out of the rocks of Devil's Den and the Southern Army overrunning Devil's Den. I used to have a T-shirt with this drawing on it that they sold around town, the Devil's Den. And it's comes from the Library of Congress. You can actually look at the original drawing if you get on the Library of Congress website and see it. And one interesting thing about it is that, and it's obvious when you look at it at the Library of Congress, it says the Devil's Den. But the Devil's Den written underneath of it is obviously in a different style, and it's written much later. And it actually says, I think the caption, Vincent's Brigade maybe on it. But I think to make the long story short is this drawing is clearly not Devil's Den. It doesn't look like Devil's Den. You can't line the rocks up. And in Wode's sketches, most of the time, it's really easy to line up Wode's sketches with actual places and see where they're drawn from. It has a feel that this is Little Round Top and not in the sketch and not Devil's Den.
So that kind of ties into what you were saying before about how everybody called the whole area Devil's Den.
I think what happened was in this particular instance, this is a drawing of Vincent's brigade, and perhaps it's even drawn from the base of Big Round Top or from Little Round Top behind us. And at some later point, someone was looking for a drawing of Devil's Den and just wrote Devil's Den on the sketch at a later time. And so the most famous sketch of the fighting at Devil's Den is not Devil's Den, clearly. And I say this because the sketch is from like the parking area in the slaughter pen looking at the rocks of Devil's Den, but then you can see the mountains in the background, and there's no point down there where you can see the mountains from the background, and the sketch doesn't look at all like the rocks of Devil's Den.
All right. Ohio's Civil War makes his debut. He says, "It's been a while since I've read fonts, but the Devil's Den slaughter pen timeline has always confounded me with regard to the federal units going in. 99th PA, 40th New York, 6th New Jersey, then the regulars nearby, and the multiple waves of Confederate attacks. Would love to have a breakdown of who was fighting whom and in what order."
And please include the 4th Maine in there.
Yeah.
Well, first I should mention that this is not a problem that is this is a common problem. And I think it's one that we all have when we think about the battle and what's happening at the same time. And I remember one time I was working for Travel Brains when Wayne Motz did a computer graphic map of the battle. And it happened again recently to me when there was this guy that I think you knew him, Bob. I forget his name, but he was doing a map and trying to show all the troop positions on the second day at the same time on a computer-generated map. And the thing about it is we know the chronology of the fighting on Little Round Top. We know the chronology of the fighting at Devil's Den. We know the chronology of the fighting of the wheat field, and we know the chronology of the fighting of the peach orchard. But do we know when something is happening on Little Round Top at that same moment what is happening at the peach orchard? See, you can only tie things together by tying them into other accounts. So, for instance, we know that at Devil's Den, like the arrival of the 99th Pennsylvania on the top of Devil's Den from the right flank is happening at the same time that the 4th Maine is charging up the side of the hill because the two accounts talk about each other. Or we know when the charge of the 124th is. But we don't have like a lot of accounts that talk about what's going on at Devil's Den and also comparing it to what's happening at Little Round Top. So some of this, the tying these things together, we kind of are guessing about this. Okay. And then the other problem is when you read a book such as Fonz, he has a chapter called Little Round Top, where he talks about the beginning of the fight all the way to the end. And then there's a chapter called Devil's Den, where you talk about the fighting at Devil's Den from the beginning to the end. And then there's a chapter called The Wheat Field. And,
so it's like you have to take those chapters and like cut and paste them together according to the times that he lays out there if you want to try to get an idea of what's going on at the same time.
And perhaps the author who's writing the book doesn't know.
Right. So that's why he's doing it in separate chapters.
And like I say, I'm not so sure that I know. And this is an issue. I think that people assume when they read a book about something that the author has a grasp of the chronology of the events. And in often cases, that's not so. And I'm not being critical of the author who we're talking about in any case. It's just that it's very, very, very difficult.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting book. If this listener is interested in it, it's called like The Ebb and Tide of Battle. Have you seen that, Bob? We have a copy in the guide room. It costs like $60. No one's buying this book. This guy, and I've never met the guy, I don't even remember his name. He broke down the battle in 15-minute segments. And then he has every 15 minutes, and then he has what's happening at that interval from his reading of all the sources. And I looked at it, and because he was forcing himself to do this, he had events, and he's like, okay, what do I do with this? And he had to stick it in somewhere. And in his excitement to try to stick these things in somewhere, I was like, oh my God, this is horrible.
Is it really?
Because you can't do it. You just can't do it. You start to create a fictional scenario because you're doing, we just don't know.
But the sources, I mean, the firsthand accounts, and they put in times. We don't know that those times are all the same.
That's right.
A 4 o'clock to one guy could be 3:30 to another guy.
I remember one time I was on a tour. Gary and I were on a tour the first day, and this guy came up to me and argued with me about how all the times in the official reports are based upon one time that he suggested that all the officers got together and they synchronized their watches. And I'm here to tell you that is not true at all. And
where did he get that?
I had this long argument with him. I mean, there's even an article written by a guy in the 12th Massachusetts on the first day, and he talked about that. He specifically talks about timing in the battle and how everybody has a different time on their watch.
Right.
And it could be as much as an hour different.
Yeah.
And you look at these times given in the official reports, and and we can kind of, so I think then instead of being obsessed with time things happen, you need to understand the flow or the chronology. And so here, let me try to make it simple for just the Battle of Devil's Den. And simply put, initially, Ward's brigade is on top of Devil's Den, and initially, the 1st Texas and the 3rd Arkansas attack. And at that point, the 4th Maine Infantry, as Bob mentioned, are actually down in the valley. And the 1st Texas and 3rd Arkansas attack, when you get to the base of the hill, the 124th New York that's up here where we are, looks out and sees that there's a second wave assembling and Benning's brigades ready to make the attack. So the 124th New York charge down across to the base of Houck's Ridge into the 1st Texas. Field? Into the triangular-shaped field, we call it, which is a more modern term. But they charge down the slopes across what is now the triangular-shaped field. And as they're doing that, Lawl's brigade, who had been on the right flank, Evander Law, pulled 2 regiments off the right flank of his brigade and sent them across behind the rest of the formation to attack Smith's guns at Devil's Den, which were actually laying some heavy fire into them. I mentioned Law not giving an order as a division commander, but this is as a brigade commander. So these 2 regiments actually arrive near the area of Devil's Den just as the 124th New York is at the farthest point of advance in their charge, and they smash into the flank of the 124th New York, and that unit retreats back up to the top of the hill, and they're pretty much out of the battle. And then elements of the 1st Texas and elements of the 44th Alabama overrun Smith's battery. Smith is pulled out. He's with his rear section. At this moment, it's obvious that the 4th Maine, who were sent to the valley and sort of provide a blocking force against the Confederate attack, pull back, and they charge up to the top of the hill into Smith's guns, and they drive the 1st Texas and elements of the 44th Alabama out of Smith's guns and recapture the guns. It's at this moment that the 99th Pennsylvania arrive. They were originally in the right flank of Ward's brigade. They are pulled out of line. They charge through the Rosewood lot, and they swing behind the 4th Maine and charge into more of the Confederates, and Smith's guns are recaptured by the Union Army, and they try to pull a line of battle together. In the meantime, Benning's brigade arrives, and Henry Louis Benning takes command, and he's able to pull together men from Arkansas, men from Texas, men from Georgia, and men from Alabama. 4 different states, 3 different brigades. He forms a solid line of battle down there. He does it in a matter of minutes, and the Confederate force advances again on the top of this ridge and through the Valley of Death and overruns and captures Devil's Den. In the meantime, reinforcements were sent here. Mm-hmm. The 40th New York and the 6th New Jersey. The 6th New Jersey arrives first. Unfortunately, they cut off the fire of Smith's rear section in the Valley of Death, which was providing very valuable service, not just for the men at Devil's Den, but they were probably firing across the slopes of Little Round Top into the Texans that were starting to advance behind us up the hill. And the 6th New Jersey arrives, and then the 40th New York swing down through the Valley of Death. But in the meantime, the Benning's Brigade, the Georgians, have captured Devil's Den. They're standing right where we are, and they fire into the flank of the 40th New York in the Valley of Death, and then that unit is forced out. And then after that, we have this situation where Benning's Brigade is here at Devil's Den. The fighting for Little Round Top is taking place. And then the U.S. regulars cross the Valley of Death into the wheat field just north of us. They're driven out. And then eventually the Pennsylvania Reserves come down through the Valley of Death and into the wheat field. And Benning's Brigade is pretty much just holding on to the position that they have occupied. One interesting thing about this, it's more difficult with the fighting that's occurring out towards the wheat field. But we do have an interesting account that when the 4th Maine are in the valley, there's an account by a guy in the 4th Maine who says that Vincent's brigade has arrived on Little Round Top. So Vincent's brigade apparently arrived while the 4th Maine was still in the valley. And this guy mentions that if they could just swing out a couple companies and spread them out, maybe they could join and create a solid line between Little Round Top and Devil's Den, which, of course, seems ridiculous to us today.
Right.
But they do mention that. Oh, and one other thing I'll mention, Bob, is that in the wheat field, we know this. As part of tying the two in, we know that the 86th New York and the 20th Indiana maintain that they were not driven out of Devil's Den. They maintained in their official reports that they were relieved, that Cross's brigade of the 2nd Army Corps comes in and relieves them, and they're pulled out at that moment. So we can tie those things in together, that the fight for Devil's Den is pretty much over when Cross's brigade arrives and takes position and starts their movement. And, of course, Edward Cross killed. Yeah. And that's when Caldwell's division arrives in the wheat field.
Okay.
Right. Is that too much, all that?
No. In fact, I was going to ask you to tie it into at least what we know about, you said about the 4th Maine, about what's going on at Little Round Top and at the wheat field as well. So thank you for that. The only thing is part of the collapse of the wheat field when Sickles's men are still there having to leave is they are also realizing that their left flank is being threatened by the Confederates that have captured Devil's Den. Am I right in that? That's another point of contact between the two.
And I think a lot of people don't think about that when they think about the wheat field action and the fact that Cross's brigade comes into position and takes up, and then Kelly and Zook, a part of Caldwell's division, are on the Stony Hill. And then Brooks' brigade swings through the middle of them and charges through the wheat field and up through the woods. That, Cross can't really move forward because there's all this Confederate activity in the woods in front of him and the woods on his flank. And they're pouring some crossfire into the wheat field. Also, when Smith finally does retreat, his rear section, Smith retreats through the middle of the wheat field. And you might have read, there's a great account where Smith, all of a sudden, he looks down and his boot is blood is flowing out of the top of his boot, and he realizes that he's wounded, and he gets off his horse, and he pulls his boot off, and it's just blood is dripping out of his boot. And then he realizes that his horse got shot in the side, and the horse's blood is in his boot, and it's not his blood. Yeah, but there's one more thing I wanted to mention. This, of all the things that I learned about when I was reading about Devil's Den and trying to put the chronology of the fighting together, one thing I realized is Devil's Den falls a lot earlier than people make it out to fall. like I'm saying, it's fallen when Cross's brigade arrives in the wheat field. And the 40th New York that are destroyed here in the Valley of Death, they were actually part of de Trobriand's force and were on the Stony Hill and pulled off of the Stony Hill as the 5th Corps units are coming in. And then eventually, Kelly and Zorc. And they pulled across and then they charged down the valley and they're driven out. So they must be driven out, as Cross is coming onto the battlefield. But Benning. Henry Louis Benning has captured Devil's Den. And when he captures Devil's Den, and let's say that Benning is standing right where we are talking from at this moment, he looks over, and there are Texas and Alabama troops charging up the side of Little Round Top, and the fighting must be at the height when he has captured Devil's Den. And all Benning has to do is say, let's go. And perhaps 1,500, 2,000 men from Georgia, Alabama, and Texas will sweep down across this valley and sweep up the side of Little Round Top. And all he has to do is give the order, and it's going to happen. And he decides not to do it. And he doesn't give the order. And you know what? He's probably right. He says he looks over at Little Round Top, and it's like a volcano, and there's fire spewing from the top of the hill. And he says it's the strongest natural position he's ever seen in his life. And he's right. Yeah. If he'd have launched this assault, it would have just added a higher death toll to the Confederate assault. But this is the kind of moment that we all imagine and we all dream about. And when he decides not to make that attack, he has put nails in the coffins of the Alabamans and Texans who are struggling to capture the top of that hill. He's decided that attack is going to fail.
He just stays up here.
He just stays.
While all the fighting is going on around him everywhere else, he just
holds on to his position. And, in the official reports of like the 2nd Georgia, they maintain they beat back several attacks on this position after they captured it. But we know there's really nobody attacking this position. But think about that moment when Benning has the opportunity to launch a couple more thousand troops against Little Round Top. Just as a historian, Yeah.
So, Tim, you turned to look east from where we are to Little Round Top, and that is imposing. But I'm going to turn now because I'm facing east. I'm looking across the ground that they have already covered under incredible fire. It was a fairly hot day, and they have captured this high ground. And me, when I take the look east and I see that as was called the volcano, I ain't going up there.
It's enough. It's been enough.
I've done enough today. Thank you.
It's a hill too far.
So again, I agree 100% that Benning makes the right decision. But, I think there's part of me that needs him to make the attack. Just from everything. Now, if you ever play war games, there's a war game called Devil's Den. Mm-hmm. And it's one of Gary Edelman's favorite games to play. It was a little board game where you move little pieces around.
Okay. Avalon Hill game, I think it was.
Yeah. He makes the attack every time.
Okay.
Tim, but does he win?
I'm going to commit a sin right now, but I'm going to try to put you on the line. Give me a clock time that this decision is being made. Is it 6 o'clock?
No, I think it's let's see. If we all think that the bombardment starts before 4 and the assault comes at 4, this might be like closer to 5, so 5:30 at the most.
Okay.
And how does that, and again, I think that's what I really liked, even though I totally thought it was a farce, that book, The Ebb and Tide of the Battle.
Yeah.
I think that was interesting that this guy attempted to put these things into time frames.
Yeah.
Because it made me think about, well, that's way off, or maybe not. I don't know.
But people want to know that stuff anyway.
They want to know it.
So it's like...
People don't want to hear that we don't know.
Right.
That's the other thing about being a tour guide, right?
Yeah.
People ask us questions, and I'm like, well, we're not really sure. What do you mean you're not sure?
Like,
I thought you were an authority on this.
For? Yeah.
You know what I wanted to mention about this? Henry Benning. So Henry Benning is one of my favorite Civil War generals, and remember at Antietam, it was Henry Benning's unit that was above Burnside's bridge and held that hill for so long. Benning's nickname is Rock. Like Rock Hudson?
Right.
Rock Benning.
Well, not like Rock
And I've been to Fort Benning. And I've been to Benning's grave in Columbus, Georgia. And I'm really into Benning. But that doesn't mean I like the Southerners or the Southern cause or want the Southerners to win. And I think that's weird about historians, that we can completely detach ourselves and not like favor this cause or that cause, but like be interested in learning about one particular individual. And I mention it because I think people they don't understand how historians can do that.
No, but you have to, though. That's the whole point of being a historian is you've got to be able to detach yourself from that stuff. No, you're right. And that's true. Like if you say that a Southerner is interesting, then you are endorsing slavery.
Oh, and of course, I'm right, if anything, people tell you who know me that I'm over the top anti-Southern sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been getting criticized.
But I love Henry Benning. Love to talk about Henry Benning.
What makes you? What interests you about Benning so much?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's just one of those people I've always have been interested in.
Okay.
And that's another thing too. You can be interested in a subject and have a favorite general, and you don't have to like what they stand for or what they're doing.
Sure. Thomas 6, he asks if the guides have any theories as to why the sharpshooter, in quotes, behind the barricade does not appear to be bloated or decomposing like the soldiers in the Harvest of Death photos. And along with that, Patreon patron Fourscore asks, has the body of the soldier supposedly dragged to that infamous spot that we all know from the famous photo, has he ever been identified?
Okay, well, the first question I think is kind of easy to explain. I mean, I don't know why people, and it's interesting, the question this person has been asked a bunch of times of me and of other people. And why does everybody think that the soldiers died instantly? Isn't it just as possible that this guy was wounded in the battle and he's lying there
for 2 days,
and for 2 or 3 days alive?
Yeah.
And was unconscious, and then he died?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, we're talking about nobody's going around checking unconscious people to see if they're alive or not.
Right.
They're not taking unconscious people off. The dead aren't even removed from the field.
Right.
And we know at Devil's Den is the last place on the battlefield that the dead were buried. And according to the New York Times, it's like July 9th or 10th, and they're still burying bodies down here. And, this photograph of the dead sharpshooter Devil's Den, was probably recorded on like the 7th, and again, it could be the 6th, could be the 8th, but somewhere in that time frame. So maybe this guy didn't die right away, and that's why he's not bloated like the others. But
we don't think that it was a live person posing as a dead person.
No, he's definitely dead.
Because why?
So that's the other question I'd have
with him in it, right?
The people who ask this question, what are they? Why are they asking it? What are they suggesting?
I don't know.
Are they suggesting that he's not dead, or? I'd say that the most logical thing is that he had just been. And then there's all kinds of things. We get to talk to medical examiners. It's not unusual for a body not to be bloated. I think it depends on what you've eaten and when's the last time you've eaten, all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, everything. We don't all die the same way, and all the same things don't happen.
All right, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. They can't lock us up forever, and when they set us free, Getty's Bike Tours wants you to know that we've been social distancing since before that was even a term. Now the best way to see the battlefield just got better. When you take a tour with Getty's Bike Tours, you don't have to set foot into any enclosed space. It's all outdoors. Keeping a distance between you and others in your group has always been a matter of bicycle safety, so the more social distance between you and the other riders, the better. While you're welcome to bring your own bike and helmet, Getty's Bike assures you that all of our helmets and bikes are sanitized after each use like they have been for years. Heck, we'll even have hand sanitizer for you, as well as sanitize the pens at the check-in counter. So if you still want to tour Gettysburg after the economy reopens, but don't want to be confined to an enclosed space while doing it, then give Getty's Bike Tours a call at 717-752-7752 or book online at gettysbike.com. Oh, and forgive us if we don't shake hands. While our doors are still closed to the public due to the shutdown, Victorian Photography Studio is still doing business online. We offer gift certificates, t-shirts, and prints on our website, victorianphotographystudio.com. We are also taking commissions to shoot monuments, landscapes, and architecture out on the battlefield or anywhere reasonably local. Got a favorite photo of yourself, a pet, or your kids? Well, we could take digital photos and turn them into tintypes right in our studio. So email us at vpsgettysburg@gmail.com for prices and details, or go to victorianphotographystudio.com. And don't forget to let them know that you heard about them on Addressing Gettysburg. Plowman Cider Tap Room brings the spirit of rural Adams County to Gettysburg's historic Lincoln Square. To-go sales of our orchard-based cider occur each Friday and Saturday from 3 to 7 p.m. with pre-orders and shipping available on our website, as well as curbside delivery to our 2 free bagged meters on the square. Stay healthy, stay resilient, and we'll get together when the time is right. Call 717-420-2582 or go to plowmancider.com. That's 717-420-2582 or plowmancider.com. My favorite place to go, Mason-Dixon Distillery. They create their award-winning spirits from grain grown on Gettysburg National Military Park, and they cook their comfort food from ingredients sourced from local farms. For great food, amazing drinks, engaging conversation, and plenty of on-site parking, which is really hard to find here in Gettysburg, head over to Mason-Dixon Distillery, located at 331 East Water Street. Mention you heard this ad on Addressing Gettysburg and get a free dessert with any meal. That's right, I said free, just because you mentioned this show. That's Mason-Dixon Distillery, 331 East Water Street, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Okay, I know spots like these are annoying, but they're a necessary evil when it comes to free content, so here we go. There are 3 ways to support this show and the Addressing Gettysburg project as a whole. 1, the most effective way, is becoming a monthly subscriber at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Our patrons receive access to interviews with experts recorded especially for them. Number 2, the fun way, by getting some merch over at our store at addressinggettysburg.com. Show that you are in the know by wearing one of our t-shirts, hoodies, or other items at addressinggettysburg.com. And number 3, the free way. You shop at Amazon like everyone else, so why not make those unnecessary sales that only make you feel guilty anyway count for something? Every time you want to go and shop on Amazon, go to addressinggettysburg.com first, then click that Amazon banner at the top of the homepage, and sign in and shop like you normally would. The beauty of this is that Amazon gives us credit for qualifying sales while it doesn't cost you 1 cent more than you intended to spend in the first place. But you gotta make sure that you do it every time you shop Amazon. Okay, there. We're finished with the obligatory pitch for your support. Man, our Patreon patrons must be laughing right now, saying, we don't have to sit through commercials on Patreon. Wink. And we're back.
Okay. All right, moving right along then to the next one here. Stars723 asks, have bullets or canister shot been retrieved from Devil's Den and put in the museum or visitor center?
Oh, yes.
Yes? Where in the one that we have here?
And Bob, maybe you can answer this. We all know the visitor center has gone through different evolutions over the years. Yeah. And originally, when it was run by the Rosenstiel family, I remember going into the museum, and one of our fellow guides, Jim Tate, was very proud of this. There would be a case, and you'd look through, and it would be like, bullet found at Devil's Den by Jim Tate in 1919. Like, it would have your name on it and say where it was found and when it was found. And the whole case was filled with all kinds of weird stuff that people found. And Jim Tate, I mentioned specifically, he was a little kid, grew up here, and he would always talk about how in the old museum, he had things that had his name on it that he found at certain places. And I thought that was really cool. And I remember the thing that really got me, in the old Rosenstiel Museum, there was a piece of a jaw, and it said, like, found in the wheat field in 1932. Oh. Do you remember that, how they used to have things?
I don't remember that. No.
And then in the 1970s, the Rosenstiel sold their museum to the National Park Service, and they took a lot of those personalized tags away, and then they were just like, here's a bullet found on the battlefield. And now, of course, it's much more sterilized.
I wonder where the jaw went.
Well, and I kind of agree with him, but at some point the park went through and took all the human remains out of the museum.
Were more?
Yeah. There was a leg bone with a bullet in it.
Oh, I remember. I think I remember that.
Where they made a mold of it, and they have the mold on display.
Oh, okay.
But if anybody remembers, and they took all the bones that were on display and took them off of display, because it might be kind of wrong to display human remains.
I agree with that.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But
and so they buried them in our national cemetery. There's a special plot with all the bones. It used to be in a museum. In the plot.
Is that marked?
Yeah, it's unknown human remains.
Oh, interesting.
At the cemetery.
Yeah, and I think it was...
That was back in, what, 97 maybe? Some late 90s they buried
96.
Those. Yeah, something like 96, okay.
But they took them off of display earlier on.
Right.
And then eventually they made a coffin, and they put them, and they reburied them. And then when they found the railroad cut remains, they dug them back up, put those remains in it, and reburied them.
Yeah. Huh. Now, are you finished, Tim?
I'm done.
Well, because I won't give the name of a friend and fellow licensed battlefield guide who, unless that person would want it to be revealed,
but just
who
err on the
within
side
the
of
last
caution.
few years found a mini ball down in Plum Run. So it's not
Really?
impossible. It was a part of the battlefield that people don't usually walk through.
Yeah, right.
Right, but
How was this person walking through Plum Run for?
I think it was after a rain, and this wonderful person was just looking around to see what he could see.
I mean, you can still find artifacts on the battlefield. The park obviously doesn't want people out here looking for artifacts.
Right.
And, occasionally somebody finds one accidentally. I mean, you're not looking for them. It's just they wash up. There's places on the battlefield where bullets wash up. It used to be much more of a common occurrence years and years ago. Think about that. Here's what I tell. When kids ask me about it, because here's the thing. I do tours with 8th graders. You all know I've talked about it many times. Not this year, but on a normal year, I might do like 100 busloads of 8th graders a year.
Yeah.
And, their kids are always saying, hey, did you ever find a bullet? Hey, can you still find bullets?
Yeah.
And I have had kids find bullets on my tour. But, I mean, again, it happens less and less as the years go by. But if a place washes away and there's a bullet, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You look down, you see bullets, especially after it rains, they're white, and you can see them. But again, we're not supposed to find stuff on our tours. We're not supposed to find bullets. And I guess if you do find a bullet and you look at it, I've taken pictures of bullets in the ground before. It can't be against park rules to take a photograph of a bullet in its natural setting, right?
Right.
You're just not supposed to remove these artifacts from the battlefield. And if you find a skeleton or something like that, obviously you should report it to the park.
Yeah.
One of the problems the park has is it's hard to tell the difference between a cow bone and a human remain or a deer skeleton. So oftentimes people are reporting stuff that are not bones.
I should say too that I think probably all of us have some relics that we carry with us on tours to show kids, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And sometimes these might fall out of our pockets. I remember once I purposely dropped one when I was giving a tour to my nephew, hoping that he would find it, but he didn't see it. So someone out there, this was in the peach orchard area, probably a week later said, wow, look at this. There's a bullet.
Did you lose it? You couldn't find where you lost it?
I thought he would for certain see it and get a big kick out of it.
I'll mention a tour guide, and he's not a tour guide anymore, but he'd get the biggest kick out of this if he hears it. But I remember a tour guide that would do that. So the kid on his tour would find a bullet, and then maybe, he might get a bigger tip, or just for the excitement of the tour. But Van Nitz would drop bullets, behind him, and then turn around and say, "What's that over there?" And the little kid would find it.
Okay, Ken, I wasn't trying to get a tip from you, my nephew.
No. But here, let me hit you with this, because people ask about this all the time, and so this is what I tell the kids. So let's say there's 150,000 people at the battle, okay? And let's say every soldier fired 50 rounds, which we know is probably a conservative estimate, because many people fired all the rounds and got more ammunition, fired them all again, and and probably had double. They had a cartridge box, and then they also had ammunition in their pockets. You read that all the time.
Right.
Like, we're just talking about the 149th Pennsylvania the other day. I think they might specify in their account that they put cartridge box and then another extra 40 rounds in their pockets. So they have, let's say the average 150,000 times 50. What's that? 7,500,000.
It's a lot.
And sometimes for fun on the tours, I make the kids do the math. Okay, so let's say conservatively, there were 8 million bullets fired at the Battle of Gettysburg.
Right.
8 million.
Right.
Do you think there's some still out here?
Gotta be. Yeah.
But again, we want to be clear that we're not encouraging people to look for bullets, and it's against park rules. And when they plow a field, they'll put up a sign that says no one's allowed to go in this field and look for bullets.
Right.
But, when I was a kid, I always feel like I need to tell people this. When I was a kid in the 1970s, the park looked the other way. And I remember people metal detecting on a little round top, and the park looked the other way.
Yeah.
So it was a
how
time
things change.
when there was a time when this was not frowned upon.
Right.
Although in 1906 there was an Antiquities Act that said that people could not be taking stuff off the battlefield. So from 1906 through the 1930s, when this Rose's Steel Museum was filled with artifacts of kids finding stuff, they were not allowed by law to do that anyway.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Civil_war_nerd on Instagram wants to know if there was anything interesting, depending on how you guys define interesting, that happens on your tours of Devil's Den. I'm thinking kids falling between the crevices in the crevices in the rocks and having to get the jaws of life out to save them. Anything like that?
I had one last year, I think it was. So it was a bicycle tour. It was to a group of kids.
With Gettysburg Tours, gettysburg.com.
I suspect it was, since that's most of my bicycle tours. Is
yes.
Commercial there?
Yes, just had to throw that in there.
Co-owner of Gettysburg Tours, man.
Yes, we're dying. Yes,
but, so you often...
COVID has killed us.
You often show kids the position where the famous photograph was taken, right? And
the sharpshooter,
the sharpshooter, right? And inevitably, one of them in a group picture will lay down as if they were the person, that was in the photograph. And
we should halt for a second. Rob Gibson is riding by in his Harley.
Oh, is that what that is? Nice. We should have him come take a picture of us. There you go.
Well, he's got his whole dark room with him.
Yeah. What? No,
I thought it'd be noisier, but go ahead, Bob.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So anyway, after posing for this photograph, the kid who had never fallen on his bike before got right back on the bike and started down the hill. We can go the opposite direction on a bicycle,
right.
And he fell. Everyone else in the group said, that's what you get. You've been cursed.
Mocking the dead.
Oh, I remember what it was, too. Maybe you're going to get into the whole P. Noel or Noel or something like that. I don't know if there's any questions about that. But he had traced. I said you're not supposed to trace your finger over the letters, or else you'll call a curse upon yourself too. And of course he did that.
Cool.
And he fell.
You know what? I was thinking, Bob just reminded me that we never answered the second part of that question about the dead sharpshooter. Wasn't it about the identity? Then he has.
Yeah.
So let me just tell this story that I think it was in Confederate Veterans magazine. I have a footnote in the Devil's Den book about it somewhere, but there was a lady from Virginia that saw the photograph of the dead sharpshooter at Devil's Den and said, "Oh my God, that's my son. He was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, and there's a photograph of his dead body on the battlefield." And this made national news, and it was in the Confederate Veterans magazine. His name was Wesley Hodges of the 4th Virginia Infantry, and he died on Culp's Hill. But this gives you a kind of illusion of what we're suggesting with this. In the 1970s, I think it was, maybe early 80s, I'd have to ask Ed Guy, one of our battlefield guides, noticed a striking resemblance of the guy who was a dead sharpshooter with a guy in the 1st Texas Infantry. And then Greg Coco published that in one of his books and said, "Hey, look, this guy looks just like this guy." And then I think twice in recent years, someone has said, hey, this guy looks exactly like this guy. And so it continues on. I think, so I guess 4 or maybe now 5 times, someone has pointed to that guy and said, it is this guy, and said it's another guy. But is it really one of these other people, or just wishful thinking by these people who see his image?
We don't really know, but we do know that there are 2 images with this, what we believe to be the same guy in it, right? One from further down the hill.
Definitely. And there's even been articles where people deny this and say, oh, that's not the same guy moved. But there are 6 photographs altogether of the same body.
Okay.
4 in the original position and 2 in the position that he was moved to. And clearly it's the same guy. Not based on his face, based on the fact that there are creases in his uniform and in his pants that are exactly the same in both photographs.
Okay.
And he actually has a cartridge box that is around his neck and under his armpit. And you can see that in both of the images. And clearly, it's the same body.
So that spot there where he was posed, that little makeshift wall there, and now I've heard people saying that as far as sharpshooters go, I remember in the old visitor center, I don't know if it's still there, they had that sharpshooter's rifle with the scope on it.
Yeah, and of course, the Rosensteel family had a caption with it maintaining that one of the Rosensteels actually found that at Devil's Den after the battle.
Right.
Which I've never believed in any way, shape, or form.
Right. So, but as far as having sharpshooters like that, we would think of a sniper, someone whose job is to only snipe with that type of a gun. They didn't have somebody there
I think
doing that.
There were some sharpshooters with sharpshooters with specific rifles with the Texas Brigade at that time. Oh, really? Yes.
Okay.
But I doubt if that rifle pertains to one of these sharpshooters. But I guess getting to the gist of your question is that at Devil's Den, these were probably not sharpshooters. They were just guys that could fire their weapon really well.
That's what I'm saying. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Now, P. Noel, we brought that up twice. I brought it up and then you brought it up. So let's get into this thing here, because you believe that carving in the stone over there.
I think it's one of my finest moments. I think all Civil War historians / researchers have things that they're very proud of. And speaking of, there's something coming up next week. Hopefully it'll be released by the Washington Post that I am extremely proud of, that I made an extraordinary discovery, and it's a secret still, which I really like. Well, in a couple weeks, after it comes out, we'll be able to talk about it. You'll be like,
share it with us when it
Tim,
comes
where
out.
should we schedule our next Ask a Guide with Tim Smith?
Well, you have to see this is going to be one of my finest moments again.
You tried to get him to divulge.
I tried to get him to divulge. I
can't talk about it yet. I did want to bring it up though, so that people would know that I got something really nice coming up here in a couple weeks. I hopefully next week, but P. Noel is I think one of for researchers, pure research, it's a fine moment. And I remember the moment when I decided to try to figure it out. There are rock carvings all over the battlefield where people have carved their name into the rocks. And over the years, people have asked, who carved their name here? How do we tell? A lot of them are just initials. And there's really no way to ever discover initials in rocks and when they were made. There is a rock carving on that rock right there where one of your listeners is actually sitting next to at the moment.
Oh, really?
I forget the name. I forget. I'll have to show you.
We'll have to look at it when we're done.
But this rock carving down there near Smith's Battery says P. Noel.
Or Noel.
Yeah. The first Noel.
Right.
It's spelled like that.
Yeah.
But locally, that name is Noel. So it's down there in the rock, and it's very professionally done as opposed to the scribbling on some of the rocks that you see. And so we were on a battlefield guided tour, and it was the first time when Gary and I had done a tour of Devil's Den together, and we did it for the licensed battlefield guides. And the purpose of the tour was to reveal some of the information that we had discovered in our research, and this was prior to our book coming out. So it was a tour that was given just for the guides and saying, hey, we've been working on a book on Devil's Den, and this is the things we've discovered. And we talked about P. Noel, and Deb Novotny, a longtime licensed battlefield guide, said to me, Tim, you're at the historical society all the time. Can't you figure out who this carving is? I was like, well, maybe I should. So what I did was we have a large file of obituaries of Adams County residents in local newspapers. And so I took all the local people named Noel, because by and large, the rock carvings are done by local people. Soldiers don't have time to carve their name in one of these hard rocks with a chisel.
Right.
And where they're going to get the chisel.
Right.
And most of them are done by, people much later when they have time. And so I went through the file of Noels, and I looked at every obituary where the first person's name began with a P. And, it wasn't that difficult of a task, but I looked up these obituaries, and I came across this guy. His name was Park Noel. P-A-R-K was his first name. He lived on the Baltimore Pike, and I think in 1888, he was like 21 years old, something like that.
Okay.
Later in life, he was a Gettysburg policeman, and he worked for the War Department as a park guide, I think, for a while. And he was maybe a local fireman. But in his obituary, it said that when he was a young man, he worked for a company that helped to erect monuments around the battlefield. And it got me to thinking, the Smith's Battery, the 4th New York Independent Battery, the monument was designed somewhere else, and the pieces were sent here. And at the very base of it, the bottom slab of it is made out of Gettysburg granite, which is a nickname for our local rocks. And it's obvious that the bottom of it is done locally, and a local firm put the monument together. But the flank markers of Smith's New York Independent Battery are also made out of local rock. And his left flank marker, which is over near the rock where the P. Noel carving is actually made of this local rock. And someone made it here, and then they chiseled the left flank into it.
Okay.
4th NY, I guess,
Right.
New York Artillery. And so it just seems like a simple suggestion by me that this guy was working on this flank marker, was chiseling the inscription into the flank marker, and then walked like 10 feet and put his initials into this rock.
Like
P.
maybe on his
Noel.
lunch break or something.
Yeah. And that made a lot of sense to me. But, and I printed it in my book, but after my book came out, it was before my book came out, but after I announced this discovery, and then a ghost book came out, and they told a totally different story about the inscription of P. Noel.
Penelope
and,
or something.
Now, if you were to go and do a survey of people with my well-researched educational book and this ghost tour book, I think like 90% of the people side with the ghost story of the rock carving than my Park Noel story.
And that ghost, is just very professional in the way she carves her name. How you can do that when you're just an apparition, I don't know.
Well, it's perfectly logical that a ghost came over here, carved their name into the rock, and now they haunt Devil's Den for whatever reason.
Yeah, and according to the ghost story, since, I'm sure people are curious about it who are not aware of it, but, I'm imagining everybody's aware of the ghost story. According to the ghost story, there's a girl named Paulina Noel, and her father was like a farmer in this area. And one day they were, I think maybe in the ghost story it's before the battle, they're passing through this area near Devil's Den, and a rattlesnake scares the horses, and she's in the back of the wagon, and she falls out of the wagon, and the wagon wheel rolls over her neck and decapitates her.
Right.
And then after they bury her, her ghost, with the fiery finger of hell, comes back and carves her name into the rock.
Yeah.
She did that pretty well with no eyes.
I got to tell you.
And with fire.
this story actually did not originate with the ghost book. I'm sure he doesn't mind us telling the story. One of our tour guides, a guy named Roy Frampton, actually used to give a haunted tour of the battlefield. And he made up the stories. And he would tell people at the end that this is all tongue-in-cheek and it was all for fun. And he made up that story. And he said that the first time he ever did it with a large group, he actually put some flash powder in the inscription and stood there and then flicked a match into and
that's awesome.
And he told this story so well.
Yeah.
On this ghost walk that he did. He did a ghost walk from Devil's Den to the wheat field to the peach orchard, I think, for a group of people that were with their friends in the national park. And someone heard it and someone told someone else who then wrote it in a ghost book, and that's how it got started.
That's funny.
So
like in The Great Outdoors with the bald-headed killer bear story. You ever see that movie?
The bald-headed killer bear.
Where John Candy's telling the story of the bald-headed killer bear, and he takes his whiskey and throws it in the fire, and this big flame goes up the chimney. Everybody's scared.
The Great Outdoors.
Yeah, I love that movie.
Yes.
But go ahead.
Oh, no. But so, we know how the story got started. We know who told the story. And suffice it to say, no one named Paulina Noel ever lived or died anywhere near Devil's Den. But again, if you were to, just do a survey of people, I'm sure that's going to be much more popular than my Park Noel story.
Now, did the company that Park Noel worked for, did they also do the Fourth Main Monument?
Well, I don't think we know what company, now the Fourth Main inscription, you're talking about the other rock carving? We don't know the name of the company he worked for.
I thought I had read when last year when I did that video about P. Noel, I Googled it and I found an article that either you had written or were part of or just cited you, I can't remember, and it said that you believe that he worked with the company that did some kind of work on the Fourth Main as well.
I don't know, maybe Gary did. I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe
I personally, I don't know the name of the company Park Noel worked for.
Okay, all right, that's fine. All right, let's move on. We're almost done here.
That was awesome.
By the way, the weather, this is almost May and it feels like November. What the hell is going on? I can't stand this.
But you really pick like the coldest days of the week to do these.
And I did, I specifically picked the afternoon because I thought it might be cold in the morning when I was looking ahead, and it was nice out this morning.
It was warmer this morning than it is now. Oh my God.
We can't win. All right, another Patreon patron, Robert Childress, says, I have hiked the trail that passes by the Devil's Kitchen. It seems to be one of those off-the-beaten-path paths. Can you give some information or stories about it? Thanks. Devil's Kitchen.
We know in my Devil's Den book, I do have an appendix in the back of the book in the tour section, and it's a side tour, and it's the tour of the Devil's Kitchen.
Yeah. And it makes sense, too. If the devil needs a place to hang out, he probably needs a place to cook, too.
Basically, what the listener is referring to is there is a path, and again, this is primarily a path we use with our 8th graders.
Okay.
We park the tour, but you're not allowed to park buses in Devil's Den. So if you want to get 8th graders to Devil's Den, we park the buses on Big Round Top, and there's a path that you come down the side of the hill to Devil's Den, and you go back up. Now, off of that path, you can take a side path, and it goes over to a place we call the Devil's Kitchen. And the Devil's Kitchen is basically a mass of rocks of boulders between Devil's Den and the Big Round Top parking lot. At the time of the Civil War, the trees were not as grown up on Big Round Top, and you could actually see Little Round Top from the Devil's Kitchen, and there's evidence that there was sharpshooter action at the Devil's Kitchen against Union soldiers on Little Round Top, and vice versa. The Devil's Kitchen name itself comes to us in the 1890s. There's a William Tipton photograph, I think from 1898, that says The Devil's Kitchen as the caption. And in an 1899 tour book, I believe it's 1899, there's actually a description, a photograph of the Devil's Kitchen, and it says The Devil's Kitchen, and it describes the sharpshooter action there. There are other places on the battlefield named after the devil besides Devil's Den. There's the Devil's Kitchen. There's the Devil's Slipper on the South Confederate Avenue, not far from Plum Run, kind of on Bushman Hill. And that reference comes to us from a report of the War Department in one of their 1890s books. and you can actually see a photograph of the Devil's Slipper. And then there's the Devil's Bath. It's a rock in front of Devil's Den, which fills up with water often. Water's collected in it, and I guess that's where the devil takes his bath.
Makes sense.
And, I don't know how old the Devil's Bath term is, but Jim Tate, who was a tour guide and died in his 90s, I asked him about it, and he said it was called the Devil's Bath when he was a kid. Sometimes our sources for stuff, especially as tour guides, or one tour guide telling another tour guide telling another tour guide.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get to the root of the original story.
So all of the places in the park that have devil in the name are down on the south end, is what you're saying?
Yeah, they're all rocks.
So follow me here. The south end of the park, the devil resides. The devil is in the south.
Yeah, exactly.
Spoken like a New Jersey Yankee, Matt.
Yeah, sometimes on my tours, I tell people,
I'm kidding to our southern listeners. I'm kidding.
I say that Devil's Den, for some reason, is a little warmer than other places in the park.
Not today.
And
I wish it was.
Let me hit you with this.
Spring here or something.
This is my favorite. Just piggybacking on what you just said in the Devil's Den book, I found this quote that I wanted to use in the book, and I really didn't have anywhere to use it, but I shoved it in somewhere because I had to. It was such an awesome quote. And it's sort of a summation of the battle at Devil's Den given by William Robbins, who was on the park commission in later years. Let's see if I can find it here. That's funny that I'm looking at my book, not figuring out where things are in the book. I think that's funny. I think it's in this chapter called "The Attack Loses Momentum."
I kind of like how, the devil can take a bath, throw his slippers on, make a sandwich over in his kitchen,
right?
Come hang out in his den.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
That's
and
awesome.
It's all close
the
together.
devil's house.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So it was William Robbins of the 4th Alabama, and he said, quote, "We whipped the devil in his den.
Oh.
But Round Top ran up too much towards the heavens, and we didn't seem to make quite as good progress in that direction."
Well said.
All right, let's get on to the last question here. I literally was trying to type in for Google a picture of the Devil's Kitchen, the Tipton picture you're talking about, and my thumbs would not work. They're frozen. So we're going to move on here to the last question. SF Byers wants to know if there has been any more information about the Native American battle around the Devil's Den area discovered since Tim and Gary's Boom was published in the 1990s. Steve from Delaware, not Boom, book. He corrected himself. So
it's funny that I wouldn't have remembered to mention this, but I'm glad that listener asked that particular question. So I remember that years ago, one of my colleagues, a licensed battlefield guide, started questioning me about the Native American battle that occurred around Devil's Den in pre-recorded time. And of course, in our Devil's Den book, and again, I like to call it my Devil's Den book, but Gary Edelman wrote a large portion of the book. I'm sure I'd be remiss in not mentioning that. But this particular section, I'll blame myself. This particular section was written by me, and what do I call it? I call it the First Battle of Gettysburg. And I looked it over, and I realized, after people were questioning about it, and I wrote it, I should have been more clear about what I was saying in it. So here's basically what goes on. There were, in pre-recorded time, there were indigenous people. I can't even say
indigenous.
There were people that lived here prior to Europeans.
Right.
And we might not necessarily be talking about 100 years prior to Europeans. It could be 1,000 years or 2,000 years or 5,000 years. Mm-hmm. But these people left behind artifacts. And supposedly there's a field near Big Round Top. And in point of fact, it's just the whole area around Big Round Top. When somebody asks you about Indian Field and they want you to point it out, it's been pointed out like as 7 different locations.
Okay.
But basically, people are finding a large amount of arrowheads and other artifacts in the area around Big Round Top.
Okay.
And I think because the battle was fought here and early on, there were a lot of tourists that looked for artifacts on the battlefield. We're just talking about how you're not supposed to do that. But early on, people made a hobby of that. And locals picked up things on the battlefield and sold them in town or made collages of stuff they found. And when you look in these collages, like in the old Park Service Museum, there were always arrowheads mixed in with the stuff that they found. You find arrowheads. When I was a kid, I had a metal detector, and I was metal detecting a farm site south of Big Round Top on the other side of Route 15. It was the Swartz farm. A lot of people metal detected that farm. It was a hospital site. And as I'm metal detecting, I found arrowheads, and I have arrowheads that are really cool. Basically, what happened was people are finding arrowheads in this area for generations, and they find different kinds of arrowheads. And you know, someone found one kind of arrowhead on one side of a field, and then they found a different kind on the other side of the field. We today, as responsible historians, would suggest that that means that there were 2 different times of settlement by 2 different groups of people. But no, the people in the 1850s and 60s that were finding this stuff, and right after the Civil War, determined that these were 2 different groups of people, and they were throwing spears at each other, and that's why the different kind of arrowheads from 2 different tribes. And there must have been a large Indian battle at Devil's Den. And so there's a lot of information about the large Indian battle that supposedly occurred around Devil's Den in the newspaper after the battle, and there's some stories about it, and I related them in the book. And then I ended it with something like, so, you know, it's hard today for us to imagine that there might have been another battle even larger than the fight at Devil's Den that occurred at the same spot years earlier. I was kidding. Not for one moment did I ever even imagine that people would believe that there was an Indian battle at Devil's Den.
Well, when you put it in a history book.
But I guess my sarcasm was not clear enough because people keep asking me about the Indian battle. There was no Indian battle at Devil's Den. There's no evidence of an Indian battle at Devil's Den.
You should have used the semicolon and the parentheses to make a smiley face winky thing there so people knew you were joking.
Well, maybe the arrowheads were tipped with Clorox.
They were trying to get rid of the coronavirus.
Yeah. The fact is that there are lots of Native American artifacts that have been discovered everywhere all around the battlefield in the Gettysburg area, and at one time, obviously, it was inhabited by these people.
Do we know who the Indians were that lived here before European settlement?
No. There were no. When Europeans first settled the area, Native Americans had already left the area.
Gone.
So they moved to western Pennsylvania. So we don't have any interaction between the European settlers here and Native Americans. Now, the French and Indian War, that was Shawnee and Delaware Indians that were raiding in here, but they lived in the area of Pittsburgh, and they were hunting parties that came all the way across the state and then raided into this area. Okay. But we would be in the area where the Susquehannocks occupied. Yeah. But they had left the area in the 1630s. There's when William Penn settled Pennsylvania.
That's it. So I hope you enjoyed this installment of addressing Gettysburg's Ask a Gettysburg Guide. Like I said in the beginning, if you have any questions, feel free to send them in, matt@addressinggettysburg.com. That's Matt, M-A-T-T, 2 T's. And we'll talk to you guys next time. I hope you're all doing well through the quarantine, and I hope we get back to life soon. And when we do, please come and visit us down here in Gettysburg. It is a ghost town here, and I don't mean it's haunted. I mean it is a ghost town, and that's because all the tourists aren't here, and we're missing you. So we hope we get to see you sometime in 2020. And that's it. Thank you. Have a good one.